Do you know? Let's do. Which one do you want to do first?
I don't know who Paul Roux is. So
you don't know who Paul Roux is? Okay.
No. Fucking great name, though.
Dude, listen to this.
How much more would I be worth if I was Sean LaRue? At
more,
least triple, right? And how much more respect would I get?
He's also African. He's from South Africa, I think. So, Ben, you're nodding a little bit like you know who this is. Is that true?
Yeah, I know who Paul LaRue is. He's kind of like, who's the guy we were talking about that you knew?
Ross Ulbricht.
He's kind of like if Ross had been as crazy as everyone thought, but actually like 10 times crazier. That's Paul LaRue. Paul.
Whoa.
Yeah. I don't know.
All right, fill me in. Who's this guy?
All right. So all right. So Paul LaRue, he's this big old fat disgusting guy. He's like imagine
like Jabba the Hutt.
Yeah. Imagine have you seen South Park where they're like playing video games and there's that fat guy on the computer who's like eating Cheetos and
yeah.
He kind of looks like that. He's just a total slob, but he's this computer whiz. Yeah, Google him. He's like disgusting, and that kind of fits the personality of the whole story. And there's this great book that I'm reading. It's called Mastermind. It's about him, and basically this guy always like kind of wanted to take over the world. And in around like 2002, 2003, 2004, he started this company called RX Limited, which basically sold Viagra and a couple other like Schedule II drugs. So he was able to sell some opioids, but not like the famous ones, things that are considered Schedule II, which is just one below between Schedule I. And he created this company called RX Limited. And in like 3 or 4 years, it netted him hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. Wow. And do you remember years ago when you would get an email and it said like, hey, we sell prescriptions, click here. Like, do you remember that like years and years ago when you were in high school and grade school?
Not really, but go on. Let me say yes. Go ahead.
Well, basically, and then like maybe you remember like going to like these websites where it like just showed tons of drugs and like you'd get text that says like buy drugs online. Well, basically he created this website RX Limited, and then eventually he started like creating so many domain names that he created his own domain registration system. And then eventually his network got so big he created his own email system because he didn't want anyone to hack into his stuff. And at one point, he had like 2,000 or 3,000 employees working at this place, mostly Filipinos, mostly working in call centers, and he had in Philippines and in Israel because he said the Israeli guys were the hardest working for the cheapest, the cheap rate. And it was wild, and he had basically hundreds of different stores selling drugs. And the way it worked is he would somehow convince a doctor that he was like doing everything by the book. And technically he kind of was doing everything by the book, but it just really quickly warped into not. But basically he had all these doctors in America in like Minnesota, Kentucky, Florida, like these relatively small doctors, and like, hey, we're a telemedicine service. Can you fill some of the prescriptions that we're doing? It's all legal, and we'll just send you the prescriptions that we need, and you just sign off, and we're going to send it to a pharmacy. So he would send it to a pharmacy, and these local mom and pop pharmacies would be like, oh, okay, Dr. X is just called in this prescription. I'm going to ship it to the patient. No big deal. And so both the doctors and the patient, doctors and the pharmacists, they all thought that they were mostly following the law. They're like, this is kind of weird that I'm now shipping out. I'm like a mom and pop pharmacist and I'm shipping out like 2,000 orders a week. Like, that's weird, but I have no reason to believe this is illegal. Right. And eventually it did become highly illegal where like it was just like, you didn't need to see any doctor to get any of these prescriptions. And at one point he was selling like 80% of all online drugs in America. It was something large. Ben, am I missing anything? And throughout doing this is where things get even crazier. So like this story in itself is already interesting. Literally, it made, I believe, $400 million in profit in 4 years. One employee went to his apartment in Manila in the Philippines, and he said that he saw $100 million in cash in the house. And this guy like didn't want the IRS to see anything, so he would just transfer it into gold because this was before Bitcoin was really around.
He lived in the Philippines?
He was an African guy, so I believe he was born in like Cambodia and then moved to South Africa and then moved to the Philippines. Or maybe he was like Zimbabwe, something like that. But this guy had this like grandiose thinking where he thought that he's like, I owe it to the world to run the world. Very grandiose thinking. And so he hires these ex-Israeli guys to run the call centers. Eventually, he hires these ex-Israeli army guys to be his bodyguards. And in doing that, he starts learning a little bit about like arms dealing. And so eventually he buys thousands of acres of land in Zimbabwe and Somalia. And he was like, I'm going to raid an African nation and I'm going to set up like a country and I'm going to have my own, I'm going to be the leader of a small African nation and hopefully eventually a much larger nation. Like some crazy shit.
Holy shit.
It expands to the point where he's now an arms dealer. So he's selling guns to different parts of Africa. He gets in trouble for selling missiles to Iran. Like this guy gets into some crazy stuff. He's killing people along the way. He makes relationships with Colombia drug lords and trades drugs, pills for cocaine. And he starts selling $100 million worth of cocaine. And he was doing all of it, almost all of it behind a computer. And eventually he gets caught. Now he recently, in like 3 or 4 years ago, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And that doesn't include what he's convicted for in the Philippines. So after he gets out, if he gets out, he's going to go straight to the Philippines.
In the U.S. or
he's in the U.S., but because he's like basically a drug lord, they won't say where he is. And so you can online, you can barely find any pictures of him other than one picture of his mugshot. And that's the only pictures that the one where he looks like really big, that's his mugshot. That's the only picture that I've really seen of him recently. And the guy, it's one of the craziest books I've ever read. And what I started talking to you about Satoshi because a lot of people think they're like, well, I don't really, there's not a ton of evidence that shows that he invented Bitcoin, but he was talking about like creating a digital currency early on. When he was arrested, Satoshi quit blogging. And you could read a lot of this guy's emails, and that's really interesting. And that's kind of how I got to the other topic of Satoshi, where you can like read all of his old blog posts. But this guy, it's incredibly fascinating. He would have been an awesome business person had it not been for, going the wrong route. But it's a crazy book.
What was in the emails?
You just see him commenting with people. So he was actually like a really good writer for a little while. And he even, this guy is so interesting. He wrote guest posts, I believe, for the Washington Post under a pseudonym, talking about like the future of money and like all these weird economic stuff. But he was somewhat eloquent, but in person he was brutish. He was an asshole. He was disgusting. They would go to McDonald's and he wouldn't even talk to his employees. He would kind of tell them to F off. He wasn't very pleasant to be around. And but in the emails he wrote pretty nicely, actually. What are you gonna say, Ben?
They found 500 pounds of cocaine on his yacht when it crashed,
which was worth like $100 million. And he also owned a logging business in Somalia. At one point, he was like, I'm going to create a business that will fend off. So basically, all the Western countries driving through Somalia, if they want the pirates not to talk to them, I'm going to be the go-between. And I'm going to get money from them and I'm going to pay the pirates off and take a little bit of profit. He owned that business. He also was in the mining. This guy did like at one point, the DA, the district attorney of, I believe, New York said, we think this is the most dangerous and powerful man in the world. And all of it was done on the computer. And he was very early in all this. Like he's very kind of in the same ballpark as a lot of the crypto guys. And like some of his ideas, even though he was a criminal, were like totally on point with the Bitcoin stuff. So it's super fascinating.
Yeah, there's an article that says how the case for why he might be Satoshi. I haven't read it yet, but when you're talking, I just pulled it up.
You say he did it all behind a computer, and my research on this is old. I was looking at this story like a year ago, but don't I remember a story about him like throwing someone off his yacht and having people shoot them in the water or something like that?
Yeah, but in that particular story, he wasn't there. But he did kill. A lot of people think that he did kill one. So throughout this, Sean, he had his hitmen. He had hitmen that are now arrested, and they like kind of are spilling the beans. He had hitmen that would kill people, and there are a few occasions where they think he actually is the one who fired the bullet. So he did travel. So he would go to Africa. He would go here, but the guy had like 3,000 employees, and most of the employees had no idea who he was. And even there'd be times where he'd be managing. So basically, he had 2 Israeli brothers running this call center in Israel with like 300 employees, and they had never met Paul. And Paul would talk to them via email, as employees. And it's kind of like interesting because like anonymous work is something we've talked about, but that's pretty much how it was. So some of his employees had no idea who he was. So in a sense, it wasn't all behind a computer, but a lot of it was behind a computer.
This article I pulled up about him, it says he's the Jeff Bezos of organized crime, and it says he's the digital El Chapo because he was moving so much weight. He was given up for adoption by his birth parents. That rejection haunted him, and then it says he was, transformed himself into a programming genius who developed encryption software like E4M in the 90s. He founded RX Limited, which was the black market for pharmaceuticals. He was raking in $250 million a year selling drugs, weapons, and murder for hire on the dark web.
Yeah, well, I think that actually the dark web thing is actually confusing because a lot of the stuff that he was doing was before Tor was even around. So
Right.
a lot of the stuff he would do, it wasn't even on the dark web. And like this whole thing about spamming email, he was actually one of the originators of that. And so he somehow hacked into a pharmaceutical company and stole something like hundreds of millions of email addresses. And he would spam these guys like crazy. And the reason why he bought all these domain names is a domain would get banned, then he would switch a domain. So it was incredibly complex what he did. And he, before he turned to the dark side, he founded he built like a small open source product that helped encrypt things. And it eventually turned into this thing called TrueCrypt, which I actually think that thing is big. But so like the guy was pretty genius. He was amazing.
It says his first murder was he took his head of security. He said, "Hey, come to my house in the Philippines and dig a hole. I'm going to bury a safe filled with millions of dollars." And then the guy dug the hole and then he shot him with the machine gun right after that. That was his first taste of murder.
And then there's another story where they took a guy out into the ocean and they go, "Hey, let's just have a talk on our yacht." And they throw the guy in the ocean and they drive away. So he freaks out and then he comes back and he shoots all next to the guy. And he goes, "Oh, no, just so you know, I didn't miss. I'm just trying to keep the sharks away because I want to talk to you and I need to know, are you stealing from me? And if you tell me quickly, I'll kill you now. If you don't tell me, I'm just going to shoot you in your leg and I'm going to drive off."
Wow.
And so like the guy was really hardcore.
Yeah, he makes, whatever, the Wolf of Wall Street look like a small puppy. This guy's insane. Okay, wow. Never heard of this guy either. How'd you hear about him? How'd you find out about him?
So when I tweeted out that I love like crime books, and I think I had just finished, I forget what I had just finished, but someone suggested this book called Mastermind. And it's by this journalist that worked at Wired magazine. And I've been reading this book and it's freaking crazy. And even though this guy, what he did was wrong, it does like actually inspire me to like live a more adventurous life. Well, I'm like reading this and I'm like, why?
I'm the same way.
I'm like, why am I so fascinated by this? Like, this is why I don't like watching Wolf of Wall Street. I'm like, why does this excite me so much? Like, I'm beginning to normalize this in my head and think this is okay. I can't watch this anymore. But I do think that there is a thing where like I need to have a little bit more adventure. You could use it for good, but I read it and I'm like intoxicated by it. Do you get that way?
Yeah, I think that's why people love movies about, prison breaks, or they love it about bank heists, and like why people play, video games that have violence in them. It's like there's definitely like a part of us that, this stuff appeals to. And like, if you can get that outlet by just reading the book or watching the movie or playing a video game, like good, because it didn't translate in that kind of deep rooted desire for like, either adventure, thrill, power, whatever it is, doesn't have to like spill into your normal life then.
Yeah. And it like inspires me a little bit in the sense of like, man, living life on the edge is crazy. I don't want to go to prison, but
you should just add that to your bio. Top inspirations: Pablo Escobar, Paul Roux, Ross Ulbright. Yeah.
So, but
your heroes.
And one of the reasons why it's interesting is the cool thing about criminals online is that you can read their correspondence. So like when they arrested him, he had his computer open. And so they were able to like see a bunch of stuff. And I really love this era about criminals and how you can like see it happening. And that got me interested in these Satoshi posts. So basically, if you go to like, if you just Google like Satoshi, the guys created Bitcoin. If you go to Satoshi blog post, I was reading all of his blog posts, and what I found to be really fun is you go to his first blog post where he talks about introducing Bitcoin, and you can go to the forum is still up. And I spent about an hour looking at all the people commenting on it and Googling all of them and seeing what they're doing and what they're up to. And you could see them like reply like, "Hey, Satoshi, this is actually a really good idea. I've been tinkering with this. I went ahead and purchased 500 Bitcoins just to try it out." You know what I mean? It's really fascinating.
The first few comments, I think, weren't I think if I remember correctly, the original comments, like it's not like this thread blew up and people were instantly like, "Genius, this is a breakthrough. This is a genius idea," right? Like that's not what.
No, it was like, "This is cute."
Right. And so like literally the first comment. So there's Sepp Halsberger says, great stuff. This is the first real innovation. So this guy recognized it for what it is. This is the first real innovation in money since the Bank of England started to issue promissory notes for gold in the vaults, which became banknotes. I believe an open source currency has great potential, a bit like Google has become the default search engine for many of us. And then then there's some people who are like, I have questions about how it works. And then there's like Hal Finney, who I think Hal Finney got the first transaction, Satoshi sent it to him. And I think he had the most questions about it, which is why some people think Hal Finney was Satoshi Nakamoto. And I think he was also the first one to write out the total addressable market for it. I remember reading that one time where he's like, well, if this got adopted, each one of these coins is going to be worth over $1 million, right? And he broke down why, which is
it's hard to even discuss that now.
Today, that sounds weird. Imagine 2009, you're on a forum and, somebody posts this thing about how they're creating, the new world money. And you're like, well, that means this little random thing that I could go mine on my computer. You could just send me 5,000 of these right now. Each one of those could be worth $1 million. And to me, that was really impressive. The people who saw it for what it is, which is a true innovation, something that's great, something that could catch on. I'm pretty blown away by that.
Me too. I think it's amazing. When I read it, I feel inspired. And I think that's why I got obsessed a little bit with Paul Roux is just these people who just have this self-belief and vision, even if it's a horrible vision, and go out and do it. And they're in the depths of the internet. It's really interesting. And I've been reading all of the Satoshi's forum posts and just seeing these, you can click and see these guys' profiles. They're wearing fedoras and Crocodile Dundee hats. They're the nerd, the guys who I would dismiss and be like, oh, what do you know? Okay, nerd, you're smart, but you're just outlandish. I can't believe anything that you're doing. You read this and they're incredibly thoughtful and they are taking it seriously right off the bat. And I admire that. And it's a really, really fun thing to read.
Yeah, I think it's on the, I think it was a forum. It was called the P2P Foundation or something like that. It was the original forum that this was on. It was a Ning forum or something like that. And so, the people who hang out in these types of forums, right, they're obviously pretty hardcore, either into peer-to-peer, into cryptography, into these different subjects. And so, hanging out at the fringes, hanging out. I gave a talk recently for a bunch of people in the Midwest. They zoomed me in and they were like, we just want you to talk to our group. And one of them asked, they go, you said something about surrounding yourself with interested people. How do you do that? What do you actually do to do that? And I basically told him, I go, I'm a pretty normal person. I like catchy songs by Katy Perry. Right? I don't have great music tastes. I if something's in the top 40, I'm oh, that's pretty good. It's not I have this this nose for the next big thing, but there are people who have that. That's their superpower. And so I used to make fun of those people because every time they would do something weird, I would be like, oh, weird. And then I'd point out how weird it is. And I would kind of laugh at it. And they didn't really care because they weren't trying to be cool anyways. I remember in college, the guy who lived next door to me, this guy Tofik, I walked in, he was playing a video game, StarCraft or something like that. And he turned to talk to me and the game kept going. And I was like, are you even playing? Are you just, this is a computer? And he was he's like, yeah, he's like, no, I'm watching the match from last night in Korea. I'm like, what? You're watching somebody else play video games? This is back in, it must have been 2006 or something like that. And he's like, yeah, I'm watching a recording of this match that happened in the Korean server. And I'm like, dude, say 5 more lame things than that. I'll give you $100 if you can say
tell me you're a virgin without telling me you're a virgin.
Yeah, exactly. I was just oh, okay, never coming in this room again. And then later, fast forward 10 years or whatever, our company gets acquired by Twitch. And all of a sudden my title's director of esports or something like that. And he calls me, he's like, you motherfucker. He's like, oh, Mr. Esports now, huh? And I was just like, yeah, dude, it's a big thing. You were on top of it. And I sort of, was embarrassed because it was so true. I was making fun of that behavior. And then sure enough, that becomes such a, it was a multi-billion-dollar idea. I was watching other people play video games. And so I've kind of learned the hard way many times of making a fool out of myself on that. Where now when I hear something weird, I'm just immediately let me pull up a chair. So tell me, why do you do this? Do other people do this? How often do you do this? And the weirder it is, the more I want to lean into that phenomenon because I know it's just a matter of time until I discover that this is a totally normal behavior. It's like, oh, you only drink Soylent for all your meals? Like, oh, interesting. Is there a community of people who do this? Yeah. We're called, whatever, biohackers. There's a subreddit with like tens of thousands of us. Like, oh, interesting. You can start to see that the future is already here. It's just not everywhere. And like, how do you get closer to the future? You just find people who already live in the future, do weird stuff, and then you don't judge them. In fact, you just like have the opposite reaction I used to have.
And this exercise of reading these old blog posts and all the commenters is, I think you just kind of put it in a little more eloquent way, but that's exactly what's happening is like, you're seeing like, pattern recognition is kind of a stupid buzzword, but like, you're trying to like see like, well, I know for sure that A, this sounds silly at first, and B, it worked. So like, what does this like pattern of like people dismissing and like coming up with like, and how do I not make that same mistake? The guy that you talked about, what was the forum called? The peer-to-peer. Yeah, so on the very bottom of the forum, it says like about, and you could like read who the owner is, and he's just a professor in Berlin or something. Like, he's just a guy, and it's pretty fascinating. I'm like, man, like all these people were. It's like, they this is kind of weird to say, but they're like they were around when Jesus was around. Like, like they like saw this like thing that like potentially changes the next 1,000 years or the next 500 years of history, and they like saw it, and I think that's really fascinating.